But just the Community Education Network is a network of, I suppose, community and voluntary community education providers, and they're all around the country. That the network spans the country, and a lot of the members are in Dublin, but we do have members in almost every county, and we're continuously looking at expanding the membership as well. So this is a good opportunity to meet groups like yourselves. And then I suppose the purpose of the network is to provide space, I suppose like yourselves in the core network, to network, share ideas, learn, and I suppose strengthen the voice of community education. And I suppose, as you're probably familiar with, a lot of the members would be quite isolated, you know, small community education providers like family resource centres, community development projects, locally based, locally managed groups, sometimes volunteer groups. So it's a space to talk about community education and to share ideas and to strengthen the voice of the sector, to talk about issues affecting the sector. And we have a steering group, and it's made up of all members on the ground. So it's all people representing community education organisations on the ground. So I suppose in terms of like a general overview of the purpose of the network, it's a community of practice. So it's looking at the value and outcomes of community education, and sharing ideas and information, building capacity there. It's a space for reflection. So and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. It's a really important feature of the CEN, because again, with people being so busy, the high turnover of staff, Ben was talking there about funding. It takes up so much time and energy of groups, and that space for reflection is often a luxury, I think, on the ground. So we try and use the CEN as to share ideas and reflect on the work and the benefit of the work, and ensuring that we're working by our values and principles, or the values and principles of community education. It's a community of support, which is really important, I think, for the sector, given a lot of all the challenges that the sector is currently facing. A community of advocacy, which is really important, and AONTAS would be a very strong advocate for community education, and one of the key features of the work of AONTAS within our strategic plan is community education. It's raising the voice of community ed, and ensuring that it's supported at policy level and through funding, and a community of educators. So we also provide the space for training, continuous professional development for members. So just in terms of the criteria for membership, and apologies for rushing through this, we're short on time, but I can send around the slides, and maybe at some stage I'm happy to come back, Marie, if there's questions, if we don't have too much time at the end. So to become a member of the CEN, the first step is just applying for membership of AONTAS. And Marie mentioned about the core network, the possibility of being a member of AONTAS, and there's no problem with networks being a member of AONTAS. The only issue, I suppose, is that if you are coming to the AGM, there's limited voting rights. So each organisation gets a certain number of votes at an AGM. So you'd be limited in that way. If you're okay with that, that's fine as a network. The other issue is that if there are, like, often we would provide funding, training opportunities, and it may just limit you in terms of how many people could, participate or take up opportunities. So it's just something to think about for the organisation. The fee structure, the fees are, I mean, for small organisations, they're not huge. I mean, that's €40 a year for a very small organisation, and they go up depending on the size of the organisation. So the structure is there on the website, so you can have a look at that yourselves. And it's, I suppose, once you become a member, then membership of the CEN is free, for all members of AONTAS. And if you're an independent community education organisation and committed to raising the profile of community education and lobbying for the sector. So it's I suppose, the community education, we're guided by, I suppose, the principle of social change in community ed. So we try and hold on to that in everything that we do. So if you're an organisation that's committed to community education for social change, then it would probably suit you, in terms of membership. So the main areas of work then, now we have a number of CEN meetings a year, and we have different themes in the meeting. We would usually have had about 3 meetings when we were doing face-to-face meetings, but since we've gone online, we might have maybe 5. I think we had 5 last year. We've about 5 planned for this year. We've had two already. We've one in June, we'll have two then after September. And we have different themes, which often have different speakers. And again, it's just a space for networking, sharing information, and conversation. We had a conversation series last year as well, just to provide that space for dialogue within the network. And then highlighting the value of community education. As you probably know yourselves, there's a lot of work often in just almost justifying your existence within this sector. And I suppose collectively, it's a good space to be able to share the value, to reiterate amongst ourselves, and then publicly share the value of community ed. Information sharing, where we also use the information that we gather at CEN meetings through our conversations, and also more formally through surveys, through feedback from the members to inform our policy work. So any policy submissions, which AONTAS would do a lot of, would be informed by the members as well. So it's a space to inform policy as well. And then lobbying on behalf of the sector would be a huge piece of the work. And we also provide training. So we've done training in partnership with CEN as well, and with the VCC over the years. And we would provide other training courses in partnership, like for example, this week now we had Finola Butler from the Further Education Training Support Service delivering training on programme development for groups who would be offering courses leading to QQI awards, and again, it's capacity building within the sector. And we offer different types of training programmes. We are currently working with UCC around the development of a course in RPL, Recognition of Prior Learning, and that'll be the first round of that course. We're hoping to start it this summer. The fees will be paid for by AONTAS for members of the CEN as well. So it just kind of shows maybe the benefit of being engaged with AONTAS and with the network. And that's a level 7 course. And AONTAS is the national coordinator of the European Agenda for Adult Learning. So that's a European fund around promoting adult education, and that fund covers the RPL course. So these are just some illustrations of the work. We do a lot of group work, collective work. Obviously this is before COVID. We usually, actually, those photos are professional photos. They were taken in a hotel. We usually meet in community centres. So again, it just illustrates how we work collectively, and there's a focus on dialogue, and they're quite action focused. Actually, so there's Leah. She's part of your core network as well. She's very engaged, and Leah's on our steering group. So I just said I'd put up the AONTAS definition of community education. It just gives an idea of the principles by which we're working. There's quite a lot in the definition, and I won't read through it all, but I suppose it just highlights the focus of the CEN, because I suppose we work by this definition, and we're guided by this definition of community education. So it's holistic, it's based on principles of justice, equality and inclusiveness, and social change, and so on. So I'll leave that with you, and again, happy to share that if I pass on to Maria. These are just some pictures of some of the work that we do around highlighting the value of community education. So at the end of 2017, we had a conference in Croke Park, and you can see Simon Coveney. There was actually the day before he was appointed Taoiseach at the time, and we, I suppose, used that opportunity as a space, to allow community education organisations to showcase their work in Croke Park, and to talk about, I suppose, the work that they do, and also the challenges that they're facing, and to try and ensure that community education has a voice and that it's recognised for the work that it does. And this was a graphic harvesting of that event. It was a big event at the end of 2017, and I suppose I thought I'd show this because it's kind of, I suppose, it illustrates some of the questions that come up within the community education network and among community education practitioners about what the purpose and role of community education, and this is what came up. We had an input from Jim Crowther in Scotland, who has a strong history and background in community movements, community development and community education movements, and he just spoke about the role of community education in addressing some of our current crises, and this was before COVID, obviously, but you know, he spoke about the role of community education in furthering democracy, and in, you know, looking at, you know, the social context that we're living in, and how community education can address some of the big issues that are rising, you know, as a result of you know, the rise of right-wing populism, the far right, and so on. So there's some food for thought there, and I always think it's just a valuable sort of focus for discussion. And you can see Liz Waters there, who was the previous CEO of AONTAS. She was the president of AONTAS at the time. So she's included there in the picture. And just really briefly, I just think it's useful to talk about the social and political context in which we're situated. None of this is news or new to anyone here, but it does, I suppose, inform us in our work, and you know, it's important to consider I suppose the backdrop and the context in which we're situated, and this is what we're all continuously trying to respond to. And austerity obviously, you know, had a huge impact on community education, in particular the community and voluntary sector, which was disproportionately cut during austerity, and the fallout from that can still be felt across the country within the sector. Neoliberalism, you know, the focus on the, you know, the markets being sacrosanct, and the economy, and I suppose that everything, including education, becoming a commodity has a big impact on community education, and also that idea of having to prove your value and your worth in kind of monetary terms, and in terms of outcomes and so on. And often in community ed, it can be very difficult to I suppose to do that, because the outcomes are long term, they're less difficult to measure and to quantify, so that impacts on the sector as well. So it can be quite difficult when you're trying to highlight, you know, I suppose at policy level, the value of something that can be quite hard to capture and to measure. Widening inequality, which is felt across the country in communities, and the rise of the far right ideologies, which we mentioned earlier. The policy focus in community ed shifted considerably after 2008, and even kind of in the run up to 2008 before that, and where the community development programme was dismantled, and where the SciCap was replaced by SciCap, and more of a focus on working with people at an individual level towards you know, engaging in further education, and you know, around labour market activation. So that had a huge impact on that collective focus of community education. And I suppose since the establishment of Solace as well, and adult and community education came in under the bigger Solace, I suppose. There was Solace here as well, but that there was quite a shift in focus there, and training became, you know, quite a big focus at policy level, and that collective, locally based, you know, community cohesion, capacity building element was sort of put on the back burner a little bit, or sort of marginalised a little bit within the policy arena. And then of course COVID-19 is having a huge impact on the sector, and the fallout, I suppose, we'll be feeling over the next number of years. And again, just a challenge a lot of the time as a result of that social and political context, or you know, all those changes that have happened, is that there isn't a huge amount of time for critical reflection. It's almost a luxury for a lot of people to sit back and think, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Is it having the intended benefits that we would hope it has, or is it feeding into some of the problems that we're trying to serve? And those conversations, we try to keep that space within the CEN for those conversations. The loss of expertise, again, I just listened to Ben earlier talking about you know, the funding, and I had a slide there that I took out of this, but just showed like the research that we had asked Maynooth University to do a number of years ago. We commissioned Maynooth University to do around funding and community education, and just I mean, huge number of funding streams that groups are reliant on. And again, I'm just going back to what Ben was talking about there, the number of people applying for funding, and then there's short-term funding streams there. You know, there's a huge amount of administrative work, bureaucracy, and so on. I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here. I think everybody here understands this, but this is what we you know, would be cognizant of within the CEN. And the impact that this work, the context, the work, the administration, you know, the funding streams and so on, and the bureaucracy has on the values and ethos of the work. You know, again, it's so easy to just kind of get caught up in the rat race, and to, you know, continue to just try to stay afloat, through funding applications and I suppose, in adhering to the requirements of different funding bodies, and there's new requirements as well at ETB level, data collection requirements and so on. So that's, I suppose, just an overview. And then Maria asked me to talk about the charter. So through our, I just noticed the time there, it's 25 past, but I'll just really quickly run through this. Through our work, so the CEN is I suppose it's one national body and representing community education practitioners. And a number of years ago, we decided to, bring together practitioners and people working in academia, people working in ETBs, so community education practitioners and academics and community education facilitators within ETBs. We decided all to come together. We that was like 3 pillars of community education. So around advocacy, the academic work and practice. So this was the idea of coming together, was to look at the values and principles of community education, to try and hold on to those and promote them both at policy level and practice level. And we decided that one thing that might be useful for community education providers was to draw up a charter of community education, just to illustrate that the main values of community ed. And we launched this at we have at a webinar recently in April. So we've been working in partnership with Lergus, and through that they have funded 3 webinars focused on community education, and we used the first one to launch this charter. So it just highlights, over the years when we've come together and pieces of work that we have done, we drew from those pieces of work to come up with these kind of principles that we put into the charter. And it was beautifully illustrated then by Emer McNally, who did the graphic harvesting that I showed you earlier as well. So I'll leave it with you, and if we have a version of it that can be printed in any size if people want to print it and show it in their centres. And it's just, I think it just goes back to basics in terms of what community education is about. So I'll stop sharing the screen. I hope that's useful, and apologies for running through it. I was sort of not watching the time when I just flew through it at the end there.